Hey everyone, and welcome to the deep dive. We're diving into some really complex stuff today. We're going to try to understand this whole potential ceasefire and hostage release deal between Israel and Hamas. We've got some CNN articles that we're going to be looking at, and this is one of those situations where, honestly, every single detail matters. I mean, we're talking about a region that's completely on edge, a conflict with really deep roots, and the lives of thousands of people are just hanging in the balance.
You know, it's kind of wild to see how this glimmer of hope has come out of this conflict that honestly just seemed like it would never end. But I will say, don't be fooled. This is not a done deal.
Yeah.
This is such a high-wire act. These are some seriously complex negotiations, and it's all happening with violence still going on.
Yeah, for sure. So, okay, to really understand just how high the stakes are here, let's rewind a bit. Back on October 7th, 2023, Hamas launched that surprise attack on Israel. And I mean, the entire region has been reeling ever since.
Right, and that attack basically set off this chain of events that's led us to this point right now, which is a super critical moment. Now, one of the major sticking points in these negotiations, and I'm sure you've heard this term a lot, is the Philadelphia Corridor. It's this very narrow strip of land that's right between Egypt and Gaza. And it's become a huge focal point of all these talks.
Why? Why is this little piece of land so important?
Well, for Israel, controlling the Philadelphia Corridor equals security. It's their way of limiting the weapons and the fighters that are flowing into Gaza. But for Hamas, it's more about sovereignty and access. They see Israel's presence there as them basically infringing on their territory, a major obstacle to Hamas controlling the Gaza Strip.
Got it. So this isn't just like a simple border dispute, right? It sounds like it's symbolic of this deeper power struggle going on. And it's actually really interesting because we're seeing some pretty serious pushback even within Israel itself. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, for example, he did not hold back. He called the potential deal a catastrophe for national security, said it was a surrender deal, said it would release terrorists and basically undo any progress that had been made in the war.
Yeah, that's some really strong opposition, and it kind of shows how difficult the decisions are that Israeli leaders are facing right now. It's like they're walking a tightrope, trying to keep things secure but also get the hostages back. And they've got all this pressure coming at them from the government, the public, everybody.
And that internal pressure is really playing out in some very specific ways. Like, for instance, this big disagreement over the size of the proposed buffer zone inside Gaza. You've got Hamas wanting things to go back to the way they were before October 7th, while Israel's pushing for a much, much larger zone.
Exactly. And the numbers themselves tell a story. Hamas is thinking 300 to 500 meters for that buffer zone. But Israel wants a zone that goes all the way out to 2,000 meters. Like, put that in perspective.
Yeah.
Imagine you're a family in Gaza going back to what's left of your home right now, but it's in this really restricted area. Your lives are constantly being watched. Your movements are restricted. It's going to be really hard to rebuild. And it just shows how these details of the negotiation that seem really technical actually have these really real human consequences.
You're so right. It's so easy to get lost in the weeds of all the geopolitical stuff. But in the end, this is about the lives of everyday people. And speaking of those lives, the CNN articles we're looking at paint a pretty grim picture of what's happening over there.
Oh, yeah. The situation in Gaza is just dire.
Yeah.
These articles, they have some seriously heartbreaking stories from people caught in the crossfire. There's this one resident, Abdul Rahman Salama, and he talked about the destruction in his neighborhood. Called it unreal. He just wants the war to stop as quickly as it started, which I think is a feeling a lot of people in Gaza have right now.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that behind all of the politics, there are people just struggling to survive and just hoping for things to get better. And it's not even just those directly affected by the violence either. There's a ripple effect that reaches so many lives, a feeling of uncertainty and fear across the whole region. So with all of this complexity, with all of this tension, where do the negotiations actually stand right now?
Well, even though there are all these obstacles, there are some signs that things are moving forward. U.S. officials have said that we might even hear about a deal soon. Wow. And people close to the talks are using words like significant progress. But it's super important to remember that even if there is a ceasefire, the stuff that started this conflict in the first place isn't going to just go away.
Right. And the U.S. is really involved in trying to make this deal happen. Both the current and the incoming administrations are active here. They've got envoys working directly with mediators, trying to find some common ground. But there's something the articles talk about that's really interesting. It's the role of former President Donald Trump. They're suggesting that Netanyahu wanting to stay close to Trump is actually playing a part in how these negotiations are going.
Wow, that's a crazy twist.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show how connected everything is in global politics. You've got these extremely sensitive negotiations, people's lives are at stake, and then U.S. domestic politics are potentially shaping decisions on a global level.
Yeah, it's like a political thriller, isn't it? Every single move, every word that's said could change everything. But amidst all the diplomacy and all of the politics, we can't forget that the violence hasn't stopped.
Unfortunately, that's true. Even as they talk, there are still clashes happening. People are still dying. Just recently, more than 40 people were killed in Israeli strikes in Gaza.
And the total death toll in Gaza is just horrifying. The articles say over 46,000 people have died. And it keeps going up. It really shows how urgent it is to find a resolution. Every single day that passes without a deal means more lives are lost, more families are torn apart, more dreams are shattered.
Absolutely. It's a horrible reminder of how real the cost of this conflict is. And it's not just numbers either. It's all of the individual stories of suffering and loss.
So as we keep going deeper into these negotiations, we need to keep that human element at the forefront. What will it take to actually stop this cycle of violence? What does a real lasting peace look like here?
Those are the million-dollar questions. And while the CNN articles give us a lot of information about what's happening right now, they also make us ask some even bigger, more challenging questions. Questions about the future of this region and whether peace can really last.
So stay with us as we keep going on this deep dive, because what we find out here, it's not just about understanding a news story. It's about understanding some of the biggest questions of our time. Questions of conflict, of peace, of justice, and what kind of future we're building for ourselves and for the generations that come after us.
It's really easy to just focus on getting a ceasefire done, right?
Yeah.
But the real challenge is figuring out how to make peace actually last. And that means dealing with some super tough, deep-rooted issues.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Well, one big one is the humanitarian situation in Gaza.
Yeah.
The articles really highlight how desperate things are over there. People need aid, they need medical supplies, just basic necessities. Imagine you're trying to rebuild your life after all this trauma, but you don't even have the things you need to survive.
I can't even imagine that level of despair.
Right. And then on top of all that, you've got this political deadlock between Israel and Hamas. There's so much distrust, so much animosity going back years, and they just have completely different ideas about what the future should look like. If you don't address these core problems, any ceasefire is just a Band-Aid. It might stop things for a bit, but the wound's still there.
Yeah, some people might say that even a temporary pause is better than nothing. But is it possible that a deal that doesn't fix the underlying problems could actually make things worse in the long run? Like, could it make Hamas stronger and actually hurt the chances for a real lasting peace?
That's a really valid concern. Some Israeli officials, like that finance minister, Smotrich, they think that giving anything to Hamas now will just make them more powerful. It'll make it harder to negotiate with them in the future. They're saying any deal has to include Hamas recognizing Israel's right to exist and promising to stop the violence.
So it's this crazy balancing act. You've got the immediate need to stop people from dying and to get hostages back, but then you've got these massive political problems that if you don't fix them, they could lead to even more conflict later on.
And don't forget the human side of all of this.
Yeah.
In the middle of all these political calculations are real people. Their lives are directly affected by the decisions that get made. The people in Gaza have been through so much. Their voices and their needs have to be part of any real solution.
That's a really important point. And, you know, when I was reading those CNN articles, the things that really got to me were the first-hand accounts from people. There's one guy, Abdul Rahman Salama. He said the destruction in his neighborhood was like something out of a nightmare. He just wants the war to be over as fast as it started. And I bet a lot of people in Gaza feel that way. They just want a chance to rebuild their lives and have some peace.
Yeah, his words are a reminder that behind all of the political stuff, there are regular people who are just trying to get through each day. They're trying to pick up the pieces of their lives. And it's not just about rebuilding physically either. It's about the emotional toll of going through something so horrible.
It makes you think about what real sustainable peace means in this kind of situation. It's not just about stopping the fighting. It's about fixing the things that caused the conflict in the first place. It's about healing the wounds, about creating a future where people don't have to live in fear and they can actually have hope.
Absolutely. It needs to be a multi-layered approach. It can't just be about agreements between politicians. It has to be about economic opportunity, social justice, and everybody involved has to really commit to building a future based on respect and understanding.
But isn't that incredibly hard to do, especially with all the history here?
Oh, it's a massive undertaking, for sure. But the alternative, just more and more violence and suffering, is just not acceptable. We have to believe that there's another way forward, even if it means having tough conversations, making compromises, and being willing to rethink some of our most basic beliefs.
Okay, so what does that path look like? What are some concrete steps that could actually lead to a more lasting peace?
Well, first off, everyone involved has to be willing to talk to each other, like really talk. They have to listen to what the other side is saying, try to find some common ground. It means putting aside old grudges and focusing on building something new together.
And that's where the rest of the world comes in. It's not just about sending aid, although that's obviously super important. It's about using diplomacy to encourage negotiations, to hold everyone accountable for their actions, and to support initiatives that promote peace and reconciliation.
Couldn't agree more. And it's important to keep in mind that building peace is a marathon, not a sprint. It takes patience, persistence, and a willingness to really invest in the future.
So as we go deeper into these CNN articles, it's becoming pretty obvious that this is about way more than just a ceasefire. It's about tackling some of the most fundamental questions about conflict, peace, and justice.
And it's a reminder that even when things seem really dark and complicated, there are still glimmers of hope. You see moments of courage and resilience that show us a different kind of future is possible.
And we have to hold on to those glimmers of hope. We have to make them stronger because ultimately it's that belief that things can get better that's going to push us forward.
Exactly. That belief is what can drive our efforts to make the world a more just and peaceful place.
Yeah.
Not just in the Middle East, but everywhere.
And speaking of those efforts, the CNN articles really highlight just how devastating this conflict has been. The number of people who have died in Gaza is just staggering. And the fact that so many victims are still trapped under the rubble just adds another layer of tragedy to an already awful situation.
It's a harsh reminder that even if they do get a ceasefire, the road to recovery for Gaza is going to be long and really difficult. Rebuilding the infrastructure, getting medical care to everyone, dealing with all the trauma and displacement, it's a huge task.
And it's even harder because so many families are still waiting to bury their loved ones. They're waiting to find some closure, to start the process of grieving and healing. That unresolved grief is hanging over Gaza. It's a constant reminder of the human cost of all this.
It shows us that peace isn't just about stopping the violence. It's about healing. It's about rebuilding. It's about creating a place where people can grieve, where they can have hope, where they can dream of a future where they don't have to be afraid and where they don't have to suffer.
It's about creating a world where people can live with dignity, where their basic human rights are respected, and where they have a real chance to not just survive, but to thrive.
Exactly. And that brings us right back to how important these negotiations are, to the delicate balance they're trying to strike between what each side wants, the pressure from all the different countries involved, and the weight of everything that's happened in the past.
It's a high-stakes situation with no easy answers, and the outcome is going to have a huge impact on millions of people. What do you think the legacy of all of this will be?
Will it just be another chapter in a never-ending story of violence and despair? Or could it be a turning point? Could it be a moment where we all decide to choose a different path, a path that leads to a more peaceful and just future for everyone?
That's a really important question for us all to think about and to talk about. We have to challenge ourselves and each other to consider these things. Because the answers don't just lie with the politicians and the negotiators. They're within each of us, in the choices we make, in the actions we take, and in the kind of future we decide to create.
You know, we've been talking about how complicated these negotiations are.
Yeah.
But it's impossible to ignore the human cost, which keeps going up. The CNN articles say that a lot of the victims are still buried under all the rubble. Aid workers can't even get to them.
Yeah, that's just awful. And it adds this whole other level of tragedy to everything. It's not just the people who died right away. It's the suffering that keeps going. The fact that people can't even mourn properly, the sheer scale of the destruction is just mind-blowing.
It really is. And it's hard to imagine what it's like for families who are still waiting to bury their loved ones. They just want some closure. And all of this is happening while they're negotiating, while people are talking about progress and a potential deal. It makes you realize how fragile everything is, how easily it could all fall apart.
Yeah, it does. So even if they do get a ceasefire, it sounds like the really hard part is just beginning. What can the rest of the world do to help Gaza recover, both now and in the future?
Well, the first thing is getting humanitarian aid there right away. Food, water, medical supplies, shelter for all the people who've lost their homes. That's the absolute top priority. But then beyond that, there needs to be a real commitment to helping Gaza rebuild over the long term.
What does that look like specifically?
It means putting money into rebuilding things like roads and buildings and power lines. It means creating jobs and opportunities for people. And it means supporting programs that help people deal with the trauma they've been through and that help bring communities back together. It's about recognizing that the people of Gaza deserve more than just basic survival. They deserve a chance to actually have good lives, to build a future where their kids can live in peace.
That makes sense. And it sounds like creating that kind of future depends on more than just a ceasefire. It depends on a fundamental change in how Israel and Hamas relate to each other. They have to go from this place of hatred and distrust to finding some common ground, some way to understand each other.
Exactly. And that's where things get super tricky. The CNN articles talk about all the pressure both sides are under, from people within their own groups and from countries like the U.S. who are involved in the talks. There are people on both sides who don't want any compromise at all.
And then you've got other countries like the U.S. trying to influence things. It's like this massive game of chess where every move has huge consequences. It could change everything.
And as we watch all of this play out, it's important to remember that it's not just a political game. We're talking about real people with real hopes and dreams. What happens in these negotiations will affect millions of lives, not just in that region, but all over the world.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into these CNN articles, I have this weird mix of feelings. I'm hopeful that they'll make a deal, that people will be safe, that things will be peaceful again. But at the same time, I'm not sure what's going to happen. I don't know if they can really fix this conflict. I don't know if this cycle of violence will ever end.
And I think that's the main thing to take away from all of this. It's messy, there are no easy answers, but we can't just sit back and watch.
What do you mean?
I mean, we all have to stay informed. We have to have real conversations about this stuff. We need to challenge the things we think we know. And we need to push for solutions that bring peace and justice. Trying to make peace isn't like watching a game. It's something we have to actively do every day. We have to try to understand each other. We have to build connections instead of walls. We have to believe that a better future is possible.
I like that. Thank you for being here and talking about all of this. We hope this deep dive has made you think, made you ask some hard questions, and made you think about what you can do to help make the world a more peaceful place. So until next time, stay curious, stay involved, and keep looking for those little signs of hope that can lead us toward a better future.